On May 17th, 1875, in front of 10,000 people, the very first Kentucky Derby was ran, won by Aristides by 2 lengths, starting a tradition that still is going on to this day. In the Kentucky Derby, we're going to dive into history today on Daily Sports History. Welcome to Daily Sports History. I'm Ethan Reese, your guide to a rapid deep dive into sports history every day. Now, the Kentucky Derby is known now as the greatest 2 minutes in sports. But where did it come from and how did it all get started? Well, horse racing has been around for thousands of years, but it got started in the United States in Salisbury, New York in 1665. That's right, it's been around before the country was even around. In 1868, shortly following the Civil War, is when horse racing really took off. And it took off even more with the American Stud Book, which was a book promoting organized horse racing and keeping track of all the thoroughbreds throughout the country so you could track a horse's lineage, which we still use to this day. You can track people all the way back to Secretariat and beyond. But the Kentucky Derby itself really got started in 1773 when the College of William and Mary sponsors a survey of the area that would become Louisville and the site of the Kentucky Derby. And just 5 years later, George Rogers Clark would settle there and start building the town in 1778 and name it Louisville after Louis XVI of France. And Kentucky became a major player in the world of horse racing, having multiple horse races ran throughout the state. But one of the descendants that started Louisville was Meriwether Lewis Clark, who was not only a descendant of the founder of Louisville, but also a descendant of the famous Lewis and Clark explorers that were the first to make it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And he was lucky enough that earlier in his life, he got to experience horse racing, not only in America, but he made his way to Europe to experience horse racing there. And he became enamored with the Epsom Derby, which was one of the most famous derbies in England, which was named after the Earl of Derby, one of the descendants to the British thrones, and started in 1780 and has been ran ever since, and is Britain's richest flat horse race, and also known as the British Triple Crown, which includes the 2000 New Guinea Stakes and the St. Lugar Stakes, as well as the Derby, which they shorten it. And the first British Triple Crown was won by West Australian, which is a horse, not a person. In Britain, the Triple Crown is just as popular as it is in America at our Triple Crown, which is known as the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness Stakes, and the Belmont Stakes, which both Triple Crowns are 3-year-old thoroughbred series of races and just as predominant to win. But after experiencing horse racing in Europe, Meriwether Clark came back to America at only 26 years old and wanted to start his own jockey club, which he did with predominant citizens in the area. And he sold memberships to help fund a racetrack in the area. And he sold about 320 memberships for $100 each, which is about $2,800 today in 2024. And the location was perfect, as the Louisville-Nashville railroad tracks went right through the area, which would make it easy for horses to be transported to run races in Louisville. And they wouldn't only run this one race. See, back then, jockey clubs were more of casino-type things where you could gamble on races. And so they would constantly have races going on with a major push for this Kentucky Derby. And so in 1874, they began to construct a racetrack on 80 acres of land that Clark had leased from 2 uncles of his named John and Henry Churchill. And they planned to make this an almost as close to the Epsom Derby as they could, even making it 1.5 miles the same distance. And it was a simple setup because all you needed was something to keep the horses in there and stands for the fans. So it wasn't a huge overtaking. And they finished the track within a year, and they were set to run their first Derby, which the Kentucky Derby is named after the British Derby with the same name, as he really did love that distance in that race. So we come to May 17th, 1875 at the Lewis Jockey Club. 15 horses set to race. And of those 15 horses, 14 are jockeyed by African Americans. At the time, being a jockey was a good position for an African American, as slavery had just ended, and it was looked down at the time as a lesser than job, so it was one they could get and eventually do make good money at. So at the time, it was a predominantly black profession. In that first race, Oliver Lewis, riding Aristides, took off and was able to break away and able to win in front of a crowd of 10,000 people by 2 lengths, beating second place, Volcano, with a time of 2 minutes, 37 seconds, which at that time was a world record at the 1.5 mile course. This particular derby, every year, they actually shortened it to 1.25 mile because many thought horses couldn't handle that distance that early in the year. Also, some other major changes that came to was in 1883, they changed the name to Churchill Downs unofficially, and they would make it official in 1928, naming it after the uncles that loaned Clark the land. And in 1895, due to so much interest in the horse race, they actually spent $100,000 to add a whole new grandstand on the opposite side of the track. And the sport continued to grow every year. And in 1891, Isaac Murphy became the first consecutive winner of the Kentucky Derby and also went on to become the first black millionaire athlete. And this is the moment that changed everything because he was having so much success. They saw the money he was making and the white culture took over this position. And by 1911, there was almost no African Americans jockeying in the sport. Just shows you how different times were back then. But in 1904, they began to call it the Tournament of the Roses for the blanket of pink and white roses they put around the horse after he won. And they continued to grow with new technology. As radio became popular in 1925, they broadcast the first time the race, the Kentucky Derby, on the radio, getting almost 6 million listeners that first broadcast. And it's where the term, the Run of the Roses, was actually made for the first time. And in 1912, John Camden Jr. proposed that they have a Triple Crown of their own, having the best races in Kentucky. Now, this was later not taken into effect, but they continued the term Triple Crown as they connected it with the Preakness and Belmont later to help grow horse racing, and they even tried to get a quadruple stakes, including the Douglas Park racetrack, but it did not materialize. So they started this Triple Crown, and less than 6 years later, they had their first winner in Sir Barton in 1919. And in 1931, they decided to permanently set a date so that the Triple Crown could be ran at a regular schedule, as they had moved the dates around and it had made it challenging for horses to run all 3 races. And so they made the Derby, the first race of the Triple Crown, always happen on the first Saturday of May. And just 7 years later, in 1938, they created the infield with a tunnel under the track in the grandstands, giving you the chance to have admission in the infield as well for only 50 cents. And in 1952, it was the first time the race was ever televised to the nation, having almost 15 million viewers that first race. And in 1973, Secretariat, who we talked about on a previous episode, set the record for the fastest time in the Kentucky Derby history at 1 minute, 59 seconds. A record that has never been broken to this day. And in 1986, Churchill Downs Racetrack was declared a national landmark. And today, it is a huge moment as celebrities flock every year to this race. And the hats get bigger and bigger as the crowds push almost 200,000 people every year, with over $50 million in betting done every single year, making the Kentucky Derby one of the biggest races in the United States. Now, what this shows you is you don't have to be the first to be the best. The Kentucky Derby was essentially a copy of the Derby in Britain. We even took the name from them. The distance had it set up exactly the same. And though the Derby is just as successful in Britain, the Kentucky Derby is successful here because we love horse racing. Yes, we do love to gamble, but horse racing is just exciting. Something that we just inherently love. And many of us, if we watch any horse race, it is the Kentucky Derby because it's the greatest 2 minutes in sports. So don't be afraid to not be the first, but to be someone, but to make it your own. And if you have a great topic you want us to do for one of our shows, you can contact us at dailysportshistory@gmail.com. We'd love to hear any sports moments that you would love us to cover. And come back tomorrow for more Daily Sports History.